The moment the chainsaw roared to life, I knew Karen had finally lost it. My 100-year-old oak tree, a towering giant planted by my great-grandfather himself, began trembling as if it sensed the betrayal. This wasn't a random act of HOA enforcement. No. This was personal. And as I sprinted across my yard, shouting at the top of my lungs, I had no idea that Karen's reckless decision was about to set off a domino effect that would end with the sheriff's entire roof collapsing under the weight of that mass. Karen stood there, hands on her hips, wearing that smug expression she reserved for when she believed she was completely untouchable. She yelled something about regulation violations and community standards, but the truth was simple: she hated that tree because it blocked the view from her kitchen window. Because in her world, nothing mattered more than her convenience. I tried to stop her. I got between her and the contractor she'd hired. I shouted that she had no legal right, that the tree stood fully on my property, that she needed to step back before she did something irreversible. But Karen wasn't hearing a word. She snapped her fingers, and the contractor hesitated only for a moment before lowering the blade into the trunk. The cracking sound echoed through the neighborhood, a sharp, painful snap that felt like it split straight down my spine. Neighbors peeked from their windows. Someone whispered Karen's name in disbelief. Another murmured that this was going to end badly. None of us realized just how badly. Because that oak tree didn't fall the way Karen expected. It didn't glide neatly into my yard or tip harmlessly toward the street. No. It leaned hard, shifted, groaned louder than thunder, and then toppled in the exact opposite direction. Straight toward Sheriff Doyle's house. The sheriff, Karen's biggest supporter in the HOA, the man who always took her side, who ignored every complaint I'd filed, was standing right on his porch when the shadow fell over him. He dove out of the way just as the oak came crashing down, obliterating his roof in one catastrophic smash. Karen's face went white. For the first time, she realized she wasn't in control anymore. The neighborhood erupted into chaos as people poured out of their homes. They didn't come to defend Karen, they came because they couldn't believe what they had just witnessed. Karen babbled excuses, blaming the contractor, the tree, even me, anything to avoid admitting what everyone saw clearly. She had ordered the cut. She had pushed this disaster into motion. And now she stood frozen, trembling as the sheriff climbed to his feet, disbelief and anger mixing in his eyes for the first time. The sheriff stared at the ruins of his home, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Splinters, shingles, insulation, everything was scattered across the lawn like a storm had ripped through it. But this wasn't a storm. This was Karen. Karen, who now looked about an inch tall as she shuffled backward, mumbling half-formed excuses that fooled no one. Sheriff Doyle brushed dust from his uniform, his face still pale. For a long moment, he didn't say a word. He just surveyed the damage, slow and deliberate, like he was trying to decide which emotion to let surface first: fury, shock, humiliation, or the simple realization that he'd backed the wrong person for far too long. Finally, he turned toward me. "Did you authorize this?" he asked. I pointed straight at Karen. "She hired the contractor. She gave the order. And she trespassed onto my property to do it." Karen stumbled forward, hands fluttering. "Sheriff, it was a misunderstanding. The tree was a hazard. It was illegal. It had pests. It..." "Karen," I cut in. "It was a perfectly healthy tree. We both know that. You just didn't want it blocking your kitchen window." She glared at me as if I had slapped her. "Don't you dare twist this." But Sheriff Doyle raised his hand, silencing both of us. He crouched next to the stump, touched the freshly cut wood, and ran his palm across the smooth surface. This tree was alive. Strong. Then he looked at Karen. "What authority did you think you had to cut down something on his property?" Karen's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "The HOA handbook clearly states. It states you can file a complaint, the sheriff snapped. Not order immediate action. You bypassed protocol. You bypassed me. And now my house is destroyed. The contractor, who'd been lingering near his truck hoping to avoid attention, tried to slip away. But neighbors blocked his path, their arms crossed, their patience gone. Someone said, "You're not leaving until this is sorted." Another muttered, "You knew it was illegal." The contractor wilted under the pressure. For years, Karen had terrorized the neighborhood with her nitpicking, her fines, her threats, her constant need to feel superior. But now, the power dynamic had shifted in an instant. She wasn't the authoritarian queen of the HOA anymore. She was the dangerous fool who'd caused thousands of dollars in damage and nearly crushed the sheriff in the process. Sheriff Doyle finally exhaled, a long, tense breath. "Karen," he said slowly, "you're not walking away from this." Her face twisted with panic. Karen's panic spread across her face like spilled ink. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked small, diminished, cornered. The neighbors circled closer, whispering among themselves. They'd endured years of her bullying, her fines for imaginary violations, her endless demands for compliance. Now they were watching her final unraveling, and not one person stepped in to save her. Sheriff Doyle straightened up, brushing debris from his uniform, and fixed his cold stare on Karen. "You've created a mess you can't talk your way out of," he said, voice steady but sharp enough to cut through stone. "You trespassed. You vandalized private property. And now my house is unlivable." Karen shook her head violently. "Sheriff, you can't possibly blame me for how the tree fell. That's nature's fault. Gravity's fault. His fault." She jabbed a finger at me like she was casting a curse. I stepped forward. "My fault," I repeated. "You cut down my tree. On my land. With no permission." "Yes, but you knew it could fall the wrong way," she screamed. "You should have done something." The crowd let out a collective gasp. A few neighbors actually laughed. Karen had finally gone off the rails. Sheriff Doyle rubbed his temples. "Karen, enough." He gestured to the massive trunk sprawled across the wreckage of his living room. "This wasn't an accident. This was negligence. And I'm filing a report." Karen's eyes bulged. "A report? Against me? But I'm the HOA president." "Not anymore," someone murmured from the crowd. Mrs. Linton, a soft-spoken neighbor who rarely raised her voice, stepped forward. "We've had enough, Karen," she said firmly. "You fined families for Christmas lights being one day late. You threatened to tow my husband's car because he parked an inch over the line. You told the Millers their kids' chalk drawings were visual pollution. And now you've destroyed a 100-year-old oak and a house." "That tree was a landmark," Mr. Lopez added. "My father used to sit under it during summers." One by one, people voiced their grievances, things I didn't even know about. Karen's face drained of color with every accusation. "You can't turn on me," she shouted, spinning around wildly. "I've kept this neighborhood orderly. I've maintained standards. You've abused your power," Sheriff Doyle cut in. "And that ends today." Karen staggered backward, shaking. "This is a setup," she whispered. "All of you, you're conspiring against me." But there was no conspiracy. Just truth finally catching up with her. The sheriff pulled out his notepad. "Karen Thompson, we're moving forward with charges. I suggest you start cooperating." Karen froze, lips trembling. Karen's entire body went stiff, like someone had flipped her internal power switch to off. She stared at the sheriff's notepad as if it were a loaded weapon aimed directly at her. The crowd around us remained silent, watching, waiting, absorbing every second of her downfall. For years she had wielded the HOA handbook like a sword. Now she stood defenseless, trembling in the ruins of her own arrogance. Sheriff, wait, Karen said finally, her voice cracking. You can't charge me. I was acting under HOA authority. Everything I did was for the betterment of the community. I raised an eyebrow. Cutting down a 100-year-old oak tree without permission was for the community. No, Mrs. Linton said sharply. It was for your kitchen window view. Karen whipped toward her. You don't understand. That tree dropped pollen everywhere. I have allergies. Someone snorted. We all have allergies, Karen. Sheriff Doyle closed his notebook halfway. Let me be crystal clear, he said, stepping toward her. HOA authority does not give you the right to violate private property laws. It does not give you the right to hire contractors without consent. And it does not give you the right to endanger people's lives. Karen's lips twitched. In danger? No one was hurt. The tree just fell, incorrectly. It crushed my house, the sheriff reminded her, eyes narrowing. And I was standing 10 feet away from its landing zone. Karen swallowed hard. Her eyes darted to the crowd, then to the fallen oak, then back to the sheriff. She was calculating, but for once, she couldn't find an angle. Then she shifted tactics. Fine, she said, lifting her chin. Charge me. But I'm not paying for anything. The HOA will cover the damages. A ripple of disbelief shot through the neighbors. Mr. Lopez stepped forward. The HOA? Karen, you emptied half the reserve fund last year installing surveillance cameras facing everyone's front doors. That was for security, she snapped. That was for control, he corrected. More neighbors jumped in. You raised our fees without approval. You fined my wife for having a garden gnome. You threatened to remove my holiday wreath. It was tacky. Karen shot back instantly, then realized her mistake too late. Every pair of eyes locked onto her with the same expression, enough. Sheriff Doyle shut his notebook with finality. Karen Thompson, you're responsible for the damages. And you'll be answering every complaint these neighbors file. Karen's breath hitched. Every complaint. All of them, he confirmed. She swayed slightly, as if her legs might give out. She had spent years tormenting everyone around her, and now every action was coming home to roost at once. This isn't fair, she whispered, voice breaking. It's justice, the sheriff said. Karen stood frozen as the sheriff delivered his verdict, but the neighborhood wasn't done. They'd spent years swallowing frustration just to avoid her wrath, and now that she had finally been stripped of her power, all that pent-up anger surged forward. Neighbors formed a semicircle around her, not threateningly, but with a collective determination that made her shrink into herself. She clutched her clipboard, the same one she used to hand out fines, as if it could shield her from the truth settling over her. Mr. Lopez was the first to step forward with a formal complaint. He pulled out a folder thick enough to be a dictionary, filled with photos, letters, and documented harassment. These are every violation you invented, he said calmly, placing the stack into the sheriff's hands. Karen's face tightened as page after page flipped, each one a reminder of her obsession with authority. For years, she'd dismissed complaints with a smirk. Now every grievance was being recorded officially. Mrs. Linton added her own set of documents, letters Karen had sent demanding they repaint their shutters 3 times in 1 month. Another neighbor contributed evidence of Karen sneaking into his backyard to measure fence height. The pile grew rapidly, becoming a physical mountain of all the small wars she'd waged. With every addition, Karen's shoulders curled tighter, her confidence eroding like sand beneath water. She tried to speak several times, but each attempt collapsed into silence as more evidence was placed before the sheriff. Sheriff Doyle flipped through everything with a slow, deliberate gaze. This is substantial, he said finally. And it shows a pattern. The word pattern made Karen flinch. She knew what that meant. This wasn't going to be chalked up as a single mistake. This was a full-blown case of abuse of power. The neighbors were no longer powerless victims. They were witnesses. And her actions were being presented not as inconveniences, but as violations of real laws and boundaries that should have protected people from exactly this kind of behavior. Karen tried a new tactic: pity. "Everyone, please," she said shakily. "I only wanted to keep the neighborhood nice. I was trying to maintain order. I thought I was doing what was best." But nobody moved. Nobody softened. People had heard variations of this speech for years, always followed by more fines, more threats, more overreach. Her plea wasn't an apology. It was desperation from someone finally facing consequences she believed she'd never encounter. The sheriff lowered the stack of papers. "Karen," he said evenly, "this is no longer about a fallen tree. This is about the years of overstepping your authority. And these people deserve accountability." Karen's mouth trembled. Her reign was over. As the sheriff finished speaking, Karen's clipboard slipped from her hands and hit the ground with a hollow clack. It was symbolic, the final echo of the authority she'd held over everyone for years. She stared at it, almost mesmerized, as if she couldn't process that the object she had used to control the entire neighborhood was now just a useless piece of plastic lying in the dirt. But the real shift happened when the contractor finally stepped forward. He'd been lingering near his truck, hoping to slide away unnoticed, but now that the sheriff was reviewing charges, he knew he had to speak up or risk taking full blame. Nervously rubbing the back of his neck, he said, "Sheriff, I only cut the tree because she told me she had full HOA authorization. She said she owned the lot line, that it was all legal." Karen's head snapped toward him. "That's a lie. I never said I owned the property." The contractor looked offended. "You waved this big binder around and said you were the governing authority. You told me you'd handle any homeowner complaints. You even threatened not to pay me if I hesitated." Gasps rose from the neighbors. Karen sputtered, That is not." But the contractor wasn't done. He pointed toward the stump. "I told her the fall direction was risky. I even suggested hiring a professional arborist. She told me not to question her. Said her position guaranteed she wouldn't face consequences." Sheriff Doyle slowly turned his gaze to Karen, his expression darkening with every word the contractor revealed. "You understood the risk," he said. "You ignored safety warnings." Karen backed up a step. "He's lying. He's saying whatever he wants to save himself." But no one believed her. The contractor had nothing to gain by turning on her. If anything, admitting he knew it was risky made him look worse. The neighbors murmured, their anger deepening. Karen's history of manipulation had always lived in whispers and assumptions. Now, someone was exposing it openly. The sheriff crossed his arms. "Karen, everything points to intentional negligence." "Intentional? You think I wanted the tree to crush your house?" she snapped, forgetting for a moment just how unsafe it was to raise her voice at him now. "No," the sheriff replied coldly. "But you wanted control. And you didn't care who got hurt in the process." Karen faltered, her outrage draining into fear. She could feel the shift. Her excuses weren't landing anymore. Her authority meant nothing. The sheriff and the entire neighborhood were no longer under her thumb. "You're charging me based on their complaints," she whispered, voice cracking. "We're charging you based on evidence," the sheriff said. Karen's last defense shattered. Karen stood there trembling, surrounded by the very people she used to command. For years, every argument ended with her saying, "HOA regulations are final." Now she was the one facing a verdict she couldn't rewrite, reinterpret, or bully her way out of. And the shift in power was only becoming more severe as the sheriff continued gathering details. But something else happened, and something that changed the entire dynamic even more. Mrs. Clarkson, the oldest resident in the neighborhood, pushed her walker slowly through the crowd. She was tiny, soft-spoken, and rarely involved in any HOA disputes. People parted for her, sensing she had something important to say. Karen stiffened as the elderly woman approached, because if even Mrs. Clarkson was stepping forward, things were about to get worse. "I tried to talk to you," Mrs. Clarkson said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember? I told you I couldn't afford the additional HOA fees. I told you my medicine cost more than my groceries." She looked up at Karen with gentle but devastating disappointment. "And you fined me anyway? For a bird feeder?" Karen swallowed hard. It was attracting. "Birds," Mrs. Clarkson interrupted. "Yes. That was the point." A painful silence filled the air. Karen couldn't hide from this one. Not even she was bold enough to attack an 83-year-old widow in front of the entire neighborhood. Mrs. Clarkson continued, her tone trembling with hurt. "My husband built that bird feeder before he passed. It was the last thing he made with his hands. And you demanded I take it down or pay a fine I couldn't afford." Karen's lips tightened. "It was against regulations," she muttered. "No," Mrs. Clarkson corrected softly. "It was against your preferences." The crowd murmured again, anger simmering. Karen's face flushed red, but this time not with authority, with shame. "Or maybe the beginning of it?" Sheriff Doyle nodded solemnly. "This confirms the pattern of behavior." He turned to the neighbors. "If there are additional complaints, now is the time to document them." Hands shot up everywhere, stories of intimidation, threats, fabricated fines, secret rule changes, and retaliatory enforcement. Every testimony added another brick to the wall, closing in on Karen. For the first time, I saw something new in her eyes: doubt. She wasn't just losing control, she was realizing she'd never actually had real authority. Only fear. And once fear evaporates, the power built on it collapses instantly. Karen tried to speak, but the sheriff cut her off. "Karen Thompson, you will be facing civil charges and likely criminal negligence. The HOA board will also vote on removing you immediately." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her rule was over. Completely. Karen's breath came in short, uneven bursts as the sheriff's words sank in. Removal from the HOA board. Civil charges. Possible criminal negligence. It was everything she feared and everything she believed she was too important to ever face. Her knees wobbled, and for a second I wondered if she might collapse right there on the sidewalk. But pride held her upright barely. The neighbors weren't yelling. They weren't screaming. They simply stood united, their silence heavier than any punishment. Karen had always thrived on confrontation. She knew how to win an argument, how to twist a rule, how to intimidate. But silence. Silence made her crumble. I can fix this," she stammered suddenly, grasping at the air like she was trying to catch disappearing power. "I'll replant a tree. I'll compensate the sheriff. You'll follow legal protocol," Sheriff Doyle interrupted firmly. "No more negotiations. No more bending the rules." Karen blinked rapidly. "You can't really press charges. I've served this community for years." Mr. Lopez laughed under his breath. "You served yourself." The contractor stepped forward again, holding a worn folder he retrieved from his truck. "Sheriff, I also need to file a statement. She's done this in other neighborhoods, overstepping HOA authority, threatening contractors, hiring people without permits. I didn't know until today that everything she told me was questionable. I should have checked. That's on me." Karen snapped toward him. "You're lying. I've never done anything like that." But he handed the sheriff signed documents, emails, texts, job orders Karen had sent him. Instructions she couldn't deny. The sheriff skimmed the pages, and with every line his expression darkened. "This shows a pattern beyond this neighborhood," he said quietly. "That changes things." Karen's mouth parted, but no sound came out. She looked around, desperate for one ally. One person willing to step between her and the consequences closing in. But every face stared back with the same message, "We're done." Then came the moment that finally broke her. Mrs. Linton approached slowly, holding a small photograph. "This," she said, "was the first community barbecue we ever had here. Look." Karen glanced down. The photo showed families smiling under the oak tree, the same one Karen had destroyed. Kids playing beneath its branches. Neighbors laughing. The tree had been the heart of the community long before Karen began using rules to tear it apart. "You didn't protect this neighborhood," Mrs. Linton said softly. "You drained it?" Karen's face crumpled, not with anger this time, but with something close to realization. Maybe even regret. But it didn't matter now. Regret couldn't rebuild the sheriff's house. It couldn't regrow a century-old tree. And it couldn't undo years of harm. Sheriff Doyle nodded once. "Karen Thompson, it's time." Karen lowered her head. Her downfall was complete. When the sheriff finally guided Karen toward his patrol car, the neighborhood exhaled as one. Not a cheer, not applause, just a deep, collective release. Years of tension were dissolving in real time. Karen walked stiffly, no longer barking orders or pointing fingers. Her silence was the loudest we had ever heard from her. And yet, as heavy as the moment was, what mattered most wasn't her downfall, it was what happened after. Neighbors lingered in clusters, talking in hushed tones. Not with fear, but with relief. The fallen oak still sprawled across the sheriff's roof, its enormous trunk resting like a sleeping giant. Seeing it up close again, I felt a heavy sadness. That tree wasn't just part of my property. It held my family's history, carved initials, childhood memories, stories passed down. And in one reckless moment, Karen had stolen that from us. But something unexpected happened then. Mr. Lopez approached me first, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We'll help you plant a new one," he said. "Maybe not as tall, not yet, but something that can grow for the next 100 years. Others joined in. "We'll cover the costs together. I've got tools. My cousin's an arborist, I'll call him." The offers came from every direction. A community Karen had fractured was now piecing itself back together. Not out of obligation, but out of shared respect, something we hadn't felt in a long while. The sheriff returned after securing Karen in the back seat of his car. He looked exhausted, but grounded. "I'll be in a hotel for a while," he said, glancing at what was left of his home. "Insurance will cover some of it. But Karen's going to be responsible for whatever it doesn't." I nodded. "I'm sorry about your house." He surprised me then by shaking his head. "Don't be. You tried to stop her. And honestly, maybe this needed to happen. The neighborhood needed a wake-up call. And I needed to see who I was letting run loose." He wasn't wrong. Karen's misuse of the HOA had created division, suspicion, and constant unease. But the tree falling ironically brought clarity. Her authority had been an illusion sustained only because people were too intimidated to push back. The moment fear was gone, her entire empire collapsed. As the sheriff drove away, the crowd slowly dispersed. The sun dipped behind the rooftops, casting long shadows across the fallen oak. I walked toward the stump and placed my hand on its smooth surface, warm from the day, silent after a century of standing tall. It hurt, but in that pain was something honest. The worst was over. The neighborhood would rebuild. And next spring, with everyone's help, a new tree would take root, one planted not from legacy, but from unity.